Today I wanted to give a quick lesson on practicing at 3 different tempos when you're practicing an exercise or your repertoire. Another way to phrase this would just be to say that you never stop practicing slowly, even when you've brought something to a much faster tempo or a very high level. And of course, this is all framed within playing at a high quality level. So let me just talk about the common situation that students face, and we'll talk about using metronome a little bit, but then we'll talk about practicing slowly and in fact practicing at 3 different tempos and why we would do that. So a very common situation is that a student will have a piece and we can track our progress with the tempo just writing down metronome markings and crossing them off. And you can see there that I start way down at 48, despite that I ended up practicing at 112. So that's well over, double the tempo there. And I will demonstrate this in just a second. But one of the reasons we practice like this is that it allows us to track our progress. It also allows us to up the tempo by such a small increment that it's barely noticeable. But it's also a confidence thing. Being able to see those metronome things crossed off means, I'm making progress, provided that you're still practicing at a high quality level when you raise the tempo, right? But it allows us to feel confident, to look at the piece and not just say I just practice it every day and I hope for the best, but instead, I can see that I'm retaining quality, but I'm raising the tempo and I've made so much progress. So I feel so good about myself. So that's one of the reasons we do it, but common error that students have, though, is that they stop practicing it more slowly. By the way, I'm not suggesting that we always practice with the metronome. Sometimes we have to turn that metronome off and really work on our rhythm and phrasing without it. But I'll discuss that in just a moment. When we look at that page again, you can see that although I started at 48 and I ended up at 112, I have 3 tempos marked there. And those are the 3 tempos that I've been practicing at after I'd reached that fastest tempo. So let me just demonstrate first what all this means. So let me put the metronome to 48, and you can see how slow that is. So that's where I started. That was like my first attempts at the piece after I'd kind of gone over it and fingered it and made sure I knew what I was doing, but just really, really slow. And then I eventually worked my way up to 112. So obviously starting really slowly, and I worked it gradually up through every metronome marking until I reached 112. But now let's talk. So you've done that. You've progressed up to your fastest tempo. You've retained quality. You've also turned the metronome off regularly because you don't want to practice always with your metronome. In order to really work on rhythm and work on phrasing, you have to turn that metronome off. But this is just a small part of the practice session. We're not putting the metronome on whenever we play the piece all of the time. We're just using it as a tool in our sessions to practice the piece. So then once I've reached that fast tempo, I choose 3 tempos to practice it at. One tempo is kind of ultra slowly, but I chose 60 because it's enough to kind of keep the piece moving, but it's ultra slow, so it makes me rethink my muscle memory. I can't just go on automatic pilot when I play it super slowly. I have to actually think about each movement. It's really weird. If you practice ultra slowly, you actually have to rethink the piece in some ways because you've practiced it so much that your muscle memory takes care of so much. But if you slow it down enough, your muscle memory kind of stops working a little bit, and you actually have to think about what note is that actually? You don't just let your fingers go on automatic pilot. But it also allows you to play with really solid contact in the right hand, really feeling the string and then playing it in a nice thick sound, and just lots of confidence in the left hand. So I would start at 60. And so I've already practiced up to 112, but I'm still practicing the piece at 60. So, and the reason I'm doing that is to test that muscle memory and to have solid contact, but also to like make sure I can really nail the articulation I want, some of those staccatos versus sostenutos at the beginning, and make sure my each note is solid in the chain of notes that make up a phrase. I want to make sure each note I'm able to make solid contact with and play really well. Then I'll often put it to a medium tempo. So for this piece, I've kind of chosen 88. This is fast enough to feel the piece in its kind of natural state with the phrasing that I would actually use. Let me turn that on. So I'm still very confident. I'm still getting good contact on all the notes, but I can still really. But at this tempo, I can work on like the actual real longer term phrasing of the chain of notes and any articulation as well. So it's just it's faster and it's almost at performance tempo, but it's held back enough that I'm just like, it's extra confident and I can do everything much better than I could at a real fast tempo. But it's not the tempo I want because it doesn't have the energy that I want for this particular piece. I love that medium tempo because I can like play the articulations in exactly the way I would want to, like an ideal situation kind of way, which is not possible at the faster tempo necessarily. Finally, I'll play it at my fastest tempo, but I'll have a small discussion here. Is that you can see when I was looking at the page that I had 108 circled. That's my performance tempo. That's the tempo I was planning to perform it at, 108. But I did go up to 112 and sometimes even 116, although I didn't cross it off. 112 is pushing it. My fast tempo, it tests my ability to take calculated risks. My risk level is not out of control. It's still within the bubble of quality playing, but it's excitement. It's on the edge of your seat a little bit, and it's pushing me forward, and it's imparting something to the piece that the piece needs. But it's not like I can't do everything in a super idealistic way that I could at a slightly slower tempo. Choosing this tempo is very difficult because you have to make sure you're retaining quality, but you're also, you're pushing yourself and you're having some calculated risk. And calculated risk is the important thing. It can't just be risk. It has to be calculated. So, and it can be very advisable to push your tempo way beyond your performance tempo. In this particular piece, I had a hard time with that because I really felt like 108 was the speed that imparted that energy that I wanted for the movement. But anything beyond 112 or 116, my technique starts to fall apart. So I wasn't able to go way beyond the performance tempo. Sometimes, in some pieces, you can actually go many clicks above your performance tempo, especially if it's a slow movement, of course, or a medium fast movement. You can go many above so that you can really overcompensate for your performance tempo. Practicing in these 3 different ways allows you to train all the different aspects of your technique and musicality. You can practice ultra slowly to remind your muscle memory of each note, and also practice good contact and solid tone production, all those great things. Practice it at a medium tempo for confident playing, but much more work on phrasing and articulation and musical ideas, more in the context of the actual energy of the piece. And then your fast tempos are for really preparing you for performance and to help your mind understand what risks you can take. Again, to simplify all of this though, you should continue practicing at 3 different tempos even when you've reached your fastest tempo and you've checked them all off on your metronome. and even when you turn the metronome off, you just know what fast playing is. But like, you don't stop playing slowly because there's so many benefits that you need to gain from that. And I think it's just really important. One final thing I'll actually mention as like a tag on to this discussion is that when you have a piece memorized, often we will have it memorized at one tempo. And you might find that if you practice it at less than half the tempo of your performance tempo, and you do it by memory, you might actually find that you don't have it memorized as well as you think. It feels weird. Your muscle memory isn't taking care of 50% of the memory, right? Your muscle memory is like actually, sometimes when we have a piece memorized, we think we have it memorized, but actually our hands and our muscles are taking care of like 50% of the notes. When you slow it down to an ultra slow level, suddenly we start having these gaps in our memory, and it's like suddenly you're like, oh, my brain's not working. But it's actually because we don't have it memorized as well as we might think. And so practicing it at the different tempos can really help at least point out to yourself that you don't have it memorized as well as you could. And it's a great way to re-examine the piece and work on your memory again. So it's not just about technique. It's not just about working with a metronome. There's all sorts of aspects to this discussion that can help us practice our repertoire or technique exercises. And I'll just say one more time again, although I talked about the metronome lots in this video to give you more context on what I was actually doing with the tempos, you don't have to practice with the metronome all the time. You can practice a little bit with it, get the tempo into feel, and then turn it off and practice the piece at that tempo. We don't want to practice with the metronome all the time, but it is a very useful tool, so we can utilize that tool. But as with anything, you want to make sure that you turn it off and you're adding relaxation to the phrasing and imparting a natural human rhythm to the piece. So, an important discussion on practicing. Lots of information there. We could have huge discussions on this, but I hope you just keep that in mind, that you never stop practicing slowly.